You have probably sat in a classroom and done something you didn't fully agree with, just because everyone around you was doing it too. Maybe you laughed at a joke that wasn't funny. Maybe you stood when the rest of the room stood. It felt harmless. It felt automatic. But the real answer to why you did it is far stranger than habit, and one week in a California high school in 1967 proved it in the most unsettling way possible. This is the story of a class that turned itself into a movement in 5 days. Not because the students were unusual. Not because the teacher was a tyrant. Because your brain, under the right pressure, will build a cage and then ask to be locked inside it. Here is where it started. A history teacher named Ron Jones was trying to explain something his students couldn't quite grasp: how ordinary German citizens went along with the Nazi regime. His students insisted they would have resisted. They would have refused. They said it with the easy confidence of people who had never been tested. So Jones decided to test them. On a Monday he stood in front of his class and introduced a new rule. Strict posture. Sit up straight, both feet flat on the floor, hands folded. He drilled them on entering and exiting the room in silence. It sounds small. It was small. But something happened almost immediately. The students who followed the rule fastest started to sit taller with a strange kind of pride. Discipline, dressed up as belonging, is intoxicating. By Tuesday, Jones gave the movement a name: the third wave. He told the students it stood for strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action, strength through pride. He taught them a salute, a cupped hand near the shoulder, and had them use it whenever they greeted one another in the hallway. Notice what happened here. A made-up gesture repeated by enough people stopped feeling made up. It started to feel like proof that something real was happening. Ask yourself something. How much of what feels real to you is actually just repetition wearing a costume? By Wednesday, membership cards were handed out. A few students were secretly given the job of reporting classmates who broke the rules. Attendance in Jones's class, normally sparse, swelled. Students from other classes began sneaking in just to be part of it. The third wave had grown from 30 kids to well over 200, and Jones hadn't ordered anyone to bring a friend. They brought each other. This is where the psychology gets its name. Decades earlier, a researcher named Solomon Asch ran a now famous line experiment, showing that people will give an obviously wrong answer out loud, simply because everyone before them gave that same wrong answer. Not because they were fooled. Because the discomfort of standing apart from the group outweighed the discomfort of being wrong. Jones's classroom was Asch's experiment, except it wasn't lines on a card. It was identity. It was belonging. And those pull far harder than a printed question ever could. By Thursday, the experiment had outgrown Jones's control, and he knew it. He announced that the third wave was actually part of a nationwide youth movement, and that its leader would be revealed the next day on television, launching a new national political party built on the same principles. Students who a week earlier had scoffed at the idea of blind conformity were now standing guard at the classroom door, checking membership cards, reporting friends who whispered doubts. Some of the most enthusiastic recruits were students who had struggled to fit in anywhere else. The movement had given them, for the first time, a clear place to stand. Here's the twist that makes this more than a cautionary tale about fascism. The students weren't unusually gullible. Many of them were bright, thoughtful, and skeptical by nature. What pulled them in wasn't stupidity. It was a need that sits underneath almost every human decision. The need to belong to something bigger than yourself, and the relief of being told exactly what that something requires of you. Structure feels like safety. Certainty feels like truth. A movement with rules to follow is, for a surprising number of people, easier to live inside than an ordinary Tuesday with no rules at all. On Friday, the students gathered in an auditorium, expecting to see their new national leader on a screen. Instead, Jones showed them nothing. A blank channel. Then he told them the truth. There was no movement. There was no leader. There had only been an experiment run on them by their own teacher, and they had built the entire architecture of an authoritarian system in under a week, complete with loyalty, surveillance, and pride in their own obedience. The room went quiet. Some students cried. Not because they'd been tricked, but because they recognized in real time exactly how easily they had done what they swore they never would. This wasn't an isolated finding. Around the same period, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram had already shown that ordinary people would deliver what they believed were painful electric shocks to a stranger, simply because a man in a lab coat told them the experiment required it. And years later, another psychologist, Philip Zimbardo, would demonstrate something just as disturbing a few hundred miles from that same California classroom, when college students assigned to play prison guards began abusing the students assigned to play prisoners within days. Different settings. Different ages. Same underlying mechanism. Give a person a role, a group, and permission, and watch how quickly behavior reorganizes itself around all three. So what does any of this have to do with you, sitting here decades later with no teacher handing out membership cards? Consider how often you check what everyone else is doing before you decide what you think. A trending topic. A 5-star average. A crowded restaurant versus an empty one next door. You read the room before you read your own judgment, and most of the time you don't even notice you're doing it. That instinct isn't a flaw unique to 1967 California teenagers. It's the same wiring that let a classroom rule about posture snowball into 200 students standing guard for a movement that existed for exactly 5 days. The uncomfortable lesson isn't that other people are gullible and you're immune. The uncomfortable lesson is that the conditions matter more than the person. Give almost anyone a clear identity, a simple ritual, a sense of momentum, and a group that's already moving, and resistance becomes far harder than it sounds from the outside. The students who said, "I would have refused," were the same students who, 1 week later, didn't. Jones ended the exercise deliberately before it could go further, which is part of why the third wave is remembered as a teaching moment rather than a tragedy. Not every version of this story, in history or in your own life, gets an adult standing at the front of the room ready to switch off the screen and say, "There is no leader, there never was." Sometimes the only thing standing between a small compliant gesture and a much larger one is a single person willing to ask, "Wait, why are we actually doing this?" out loud before everyone else has already answered for them. So the next time you feel that pull, the tiny comfort of matching what the group around you is doing, it's worth pausing on. Not because groups are dangerous. Belonging is one of the oldest and most necessary things your brain is built for. But because the same wiring that lets you bond with a team, a family, a community, is exactly what a 5-day classroom experiment exploited without ever raising its voice. You've probably sat in a room and done something you didn't fully agree with, just because everyone around you was doing it too. Now you know exactly why, and exactly how fast that instinct can build something far larger than a single small gesture ever should.